He called me confused in front of 7 people. He said it gently, the way people do when they want cruelty to pass as concern. He patted my hand like I was a child, and then I pressed play. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am 64 years old. I raised 3 children mostly alone. I worked 31 years as a medical billing specialist for a hospital that no longer exists. I kept a household running on a single income, packed school lunches at 5 in the morning, sat up with sick kids through the night, and still showed up to work looking like I had slept just fine. I know what confused looks like. I know what it feels like. And I know, with absolute certainty, the difference between a woman who is losing her mind and a woman who has simply stopped performing the role others need her to play. That night at dinner, I was neither confused nor lost. I was waiting. My name is Margaret Louise Hale. People who have known me long enough call me Maggie. I grew up outside of Savannah, Georgia, in a small house with a tin roof that sang when it rained. My mother was a quiet woman, not cold, just careful. She believed that dignity was something you carried in your posture, your tone, and your silence. She once told me, when I was about 12 years old and furious over something I've long since forgotten, that the most powerful thing a woman could do in a room full of noise was become very, very still. I didn't understand it then. I understand it completely now. I have 3 children. Marcus is 41. He's the one this story is about, so I'll come back to him. Diane is 38. She lives in Portland and calls me every Sunday, always has. She's who I want to be when I grow up, and I mean that sincerely. And then there's little Kevin, who is 34 and not little at all anymore. He's 6'2" and coaches high school football in Tennessee. Kevin sends me flowers on my birthday every year without being reminded. He's been doing it since he was 16 and mowing lawns for money. My husband, Thomas, died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is a cruel and fast thing. We had 32 years together, and I would do every single one of them again, even the hard ones, maybe especially the hard ones. When he passed, I was 53 and still had a lot of life ahead of me, whether I wanted it or not. At first I didn't, but then I did. I sold the big house in Marietta after Thomas died, because it was too much space for one person and too full of his shape, his recliner, his workshop in the garage, the way the bedroom still smelled like him for months after. I bought a smaller place in a quiet neighborhood in Cartersville, Georgia. A brick ranch with a good porch and a kitchen I renovated myself, tile by tile. With help from Kevin and a YouTube channel I watched so many times the host probably made money off me alone. That kitchen became mine in a way the Marietta house never fully was. Thomas had strong opinions about rooms. I love him for it. But the Cartersville kitchen is where I became who I am now. I planted a garden. I joined a book club at the library. I started taking long walks in the morning with a neighbor named Ruth Ann, who is 72 and sharper than most people half her age. I kept working at the hospital until I retired at 62, and then I started doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses in the area because I like numbers and I like being useful, and I did not want to sit still and fade. I tell you all this because I want you to understand that I was not a woman who was disappearing. I was not drifting. I was not confused. I was living. Marcus had always been a difficult child in the way that very bright, very charming people are often difficult. Not mean, exactly, but particular. He needed to be the smartest person in the room, and when he wasn't, he adjusted reality until he was. As a child, it looked like creativity. As a teenager, it looked like ambition. As an adult, it had slowly, over the past several years, started to look like something else. Something that made me uncomfortable in ways I didn't have language for at first. He married a woman named Courtney 11 years ago. Courtney is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She is ambitious and image conscious, and she grew up in a family where success was measured in ways I don't entirely recognize. But she is not evil. She is just someone who, when placed beside my son, brought out qualities in him that I do not think serve him well. After Thomas died, Marcus stepped into a kind of role. He became, at least in his own mind, the head of the family. He began calling more, visiting more, offering his opinion on things he had no need to weigh in on: my finances, my property, my health, my plans. At first I thought it was grief. He had lost his father and he was trying to be useful. I gave him room for that. I even appreciated it for a while. But grief excuses a seesaw, and it does not excuse a decade. Over time, the calls shifted. They became less about checking on me and more about guiding me, correcting me, suggesting, in that careful way Marcus always had, that maybe I had misremembered, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should let him handle this, that maybe I didn't quite understand the situation. He started referring to decisions I made as things he had decided. He started describing our conversations differently than I remembered them. Once, he told Diane something I had said in a way that made me sound frail and irrational, and when I heard it repeated back to me, I barely recognized myself. I began paying closer attention. It started with small things. Marcus calling my doctor, my own doctor, to discuss my health without telling me. The doctor mentioned it casually at an appointment, and I sat there in the exam room in my paper gown feeling something cold move through me. I had not given anyone permission to make that call. When I asked Marcus about it, he said he was just being proactive. He said he was worried. He said I should be grateful someone was paying attention. I was not grateful. I was something else entirely. There was the incident with my car. I had decided to trade in my sedan for a smaller SUV, which made complete sense given that I was getting older and liked being up higher, and the sedan was 9 years old. I mentioned this to Marcus on a Thursday. By Saturday, he had called the dealership where I'd been doing business for 20 years and told them I was under a lot of stress, and he would be accompanying me to any future appointments. The salesman I'd always worked with, a man named Dale who had sold Thomas his last truck, called me afterward, confused. He didn't know what to make of it. Neither did I. I thanked Dale and told him my son meant well and that I would be in touch. I drove myself to the dealership the following Wednesday and bought the SUV I wanted. I paid cash. I drove it home and sat in my new kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about what was happening inside my own life. The word I kept coming back to was managed. I was being managed. I want to tell you about a phone call I almost didn't keep. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Leaves were on the ground and the light was already going by 5 o'clock, and I had made myself a bowl of soup for dinner because sometimes that's enough. My phone rang and I saw it was Marcus, so I answered it the way I always did, fully, openly, without armor. He didn't know I had already picked up. There was a brief pause, the kind where someone expects a voicemail greeting, and then he kept talking to Courtney, and I heard, for the first time out loud, what my son said about me when I was not supposed to be listening. He said I was getting worse. He said I was making decisions that didn't make sense. He said the car thing was just the latest example. He said he thought it might be time to have a real conversation about what comes next. He used the phrase, her situation. He talked about the house. He talked about, and I want to make sure I say this exactly right because the words burned into me, making sure we're protected when she can't manage her own affairs. He did not know I was there. He spoke with total ease, the way people do when they believe the person they're discussing is an object in a room rather than a living mind. I didn't say a word. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I ate my soup. I sat in the quiet for a long time. And then I did something that, in retrospect, was the single most important decision I have made in the past several years. I saved the voicemail. Because I had pressed the button wrong trying to answer, the phone had gone to voicemail for just long enough to capture the first 2 minutes and 7 seconds of that conversation. 2 minutes and 7 seconds. It was enough. I listened to it once. Then I saved it in 3 places: my phone, my email, and a small folder on my laptop that I labeled, with a certain quiet humor, clarity. I told no one. Over the next several weeks, I noticed things I had perhaps been too charitable to see before. The way Marcus spoke over me at family gatherings. The way he summarized my opinions to others before I had finished expressing them. The look he and Courtney exchanged when I said something they disagreed with, not a meaningful look, just a patient one, like adults waiting for a child to finish a thought they already knew was wrong. My friend Ruth Ann noticed it too. She had been watching Marcus at my birthday dinner in November, and afterward on our morning walk, she said to me, quietly, "Maggie, does your boy think you work for him?" I laughed, but the question stayed with me like a stone in a shoe. I started writing things down, not because my memory was failing. My memory, I want to be clear, is perfectly fine, but because I wanted a record. I wanted to be able to stand on solid ground. When the time came, I noted dates, conversations, specific words used. I kept a small notebook in the drawer beside the stove because I spend a lot of time in my kitchen and because no one thinks to look there. I also quietly consulted an attorney, not to be dramatic, but because the phrase, "when she can't manage her own affairs," was not a vague comment. It was a direction. and I wanted to understand where I stood legally before I was asked to stand somewhere else. The attorney, a woman named Patricia who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and looked like someone who had heard everything, told me that what I was describing was not unusual. She said older parents, especially widows and widowers, were sometimes placed in situations where their autonomy was subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, undermined by adult children acting, at least in their own minds, out of concern. She helped me review my documents. Everything was in order. I had a will, a power of attorney assigned to Diane and Kevin jointly, a healthcare directive. Patricia said I had nothing legally to worry about. She also said, gently, that the emotional dimension was another matter entirely. She was right about that. The dinner happened on a Saturday in early March. Marcus had organized it, which I should have understood as a signal. He called it a family gathering, which is a phrase that in our family has always meant something warm and unscheduled. But this one had an agenda, even if no one said so. I could feel it in how Courtney set the table with the good dishes. I could feel it in how Marcus asked me twice in the week before if I was doing okay, if I was feeling like myself. I was feeling precisely like myself. That was the problem, from his perspective. There were 7 of us at the table, Marcus and Courtney. Their 2 children, Ella and Ben, who are 15 and 12 and both lovely in the way children are before the world fully gets to them. Marcus's friend David, who works in estate planning, and I noted that the work he did, I noted it the moment I was introduced. And David's wife, a quiet woman whose name I have since decided not to remember, and me. Kevin was in Tennessee, Diane was in Portland. They had not been invited. I found that out later. I stored it with everything else. We ate. I cooked because I was hosting in my own home. I made baked chicken and roasted potatoes and green beans from the garden I'd frozen in September, and I made a pound cake from scratch because I always do. The food was good. The conversation was pleasant on its surface. We talked about the kids' school, about a trip Marcus and Courtney were planning, about nothing of consequence. And then Marcus put his fork down. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a person does when they've been rehearsing. He said he'd been wanting to talk to me about some things. He said he'd been thinking about my well-being. He said he and Courtney had been talking, and David had offered to be a resource, and they just wanted to make sure I was set up properly, that I was taken care of. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap. I kept my face still. He said there had been some concerns. He mentioned the car. He mentioned a phone call where I had apparently, this is the word he used, apparently, misunderstood some financial information. He mentioned that I had seemed a little scattered lately. He said he loved me, and he wasn't trying to upset me, and he just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. And then Courtney said, in that careful voice of hers, we just worry you're a little confused sometimes, Maggie. She called me Maggie. Only people who know me call me Maggie. She was borrowing a familiarity she hadn't earned to soften something that had no soft version. There was silence. The kids looked at their plates. David, the estate planner, looked at the pound cake. Marcus looked at me with the face of a man who believed he had already won. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I had put my phone there before dinner, on purpose. I had charged it fully. I had queued up the voicemail. I had practiced the moment, though you would not have known that from looking at me. I probably looked like a grandmother reaching for a tissue. I set the phone on the table. I said calmly that before we continued, I wanted to share something, and then I pressed play. The voice that came out of that phone was Marcus's voice, unmistakably. The way it is when you hear yourself recorded and cringe, except this time I was not the one cringing. She's getting worse, Courtney. The car thing is just the latest. I think we need to have a real conversation about what comes next, about her situation. We need to make sure we're protected when she can't manage her own affairs. 2 minutes and 7 seconds. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator humming. Marcus's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, first, genuine, unguarded, then something close to calculation. Then, briefly, something that might have been shame, though it didn't stay long. Ella, who is 15 and not a child in the way she processes things, looked at her father with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone quietly rearranging information. I picked my phone up. I put it back in my pocket. I smoothed my napkin across my lap. I looked at my son. I said, I am not confused. I said it once. I did not repeat it. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, though there was something pressing behind my eyes that I had been carrying since that October evening when I sat at this same table eating soup in the dark. I said, I have heard everything. I have documented everything. My attorney has reviewed everything. My affairs are in perfect order. My mind is sharp. My house is mine. I looked at David. I said, I appreciate you being here. I don't believe we'll be needing your services. He nodded. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. I looked at Courtney. I did not say anything. There are things that don't need to be said. And then I looked at Marcus again, and I said the hardest thing, the thing that took more composure than anything else in that room. I said, I love you, and what you have been doing to me has to stop. Marcus started to say something about context, about how it wasn't what it sounded like, about how he had only ever been trying to help. I let him start, and then I stood up. I picked up my plate. I walked it to the kitchen. I came back and picked up the potato dish. I began clearing the table the way I have always cleared a table, methodically, quietly, without ceremony. There wasn't much more to say. They left within the hour. David and his wife first, then Marcus and Courtney with the children. Ella hugged me at the door. She held on a little longer than usual. I held on too. After the door closed, I stood in my kitchen for a while. The pound cake was still on the counter, most of it uneat. I cut myself a slice and stood at the counter and ate it slowly, in the quiet, in my house, in my kitchen, with my full and functioning mind. Ruth Ann called the next morning. She always knows. I don't know how, but she does. I told her what happened, and she laughed the kind of laugh that isn't cruel but is absolutely satisfied. Good for you, Maggie Louise Hale, she said. Good for you. I called Diane that Sunday, as we always do. I told her about the dinner, about the voicemail, about Marcus. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, Mama, I've been watching this for 2 years and I didn't know how to say it. I told her she didn't need to have said it. I told her I had handled it. She cried a little. I let her. Then she asked if I was okay, and I told her the truth. I said I was better than I had been in a long time. Kevin called too, because Diane called him, because that's what they do. He wanted to drive up from Tennessee. I told him I appreciated it and I didn't need him to, but if he wanted to visit for his own sake, the porch was always open and the coffee was always on. He laughed, that big easy laugh of his, and said he'd be up in 2 weeks. He was. We sat on the porch for 3 days and talked and watched the neighborhood go by and ate more food than 2 people should eat, and it was the best visit we had had in years. One evening, as the sun was going down, Kevin said, You know what I think, Mama? I think Daddy would have been proud of you. And I had to look at the yard for a minute, at the garden, at the light changing on the flowers, because that was the one thing that undid me a little. Not the dinner, not Marcus, not any of it, just that. Thomas would have been proud. I believe that. Marcus called 3 weeks after the dinner. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. He said he was sorry. He said it didn't come out right. He said he had been stressed and scared of losing me the way they'd lost Dad, and that he hadn't handled it well. He said Courtney felt bad. He said he wanted to talk. I listened to the message twice, and then I called him back. I want to be clear that this is not a story about a mother who won and a son who lost. It is not a story where I cut him out of my life, or where he revealed himself to be irredeemably bad. Marcus is not a villain. He is a man who let fear take a shape that looked too much like control, and who had not been called to account for it until that March evening. I told him I would talk to him. I told him there were conditions. I told him I would not be managed, and I would not be discussed as a problem to be solved, and I would not have my autonomy treated as a temporary inconvenience between now and whenever he decided it was time to step in. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, it would need to be one between 2 adults, and that I expected to be spoken to accordingly. He said he understood. I said, Marcus, I've been watching you become someone I don't recognize, and I've been waiting for the right moment to say so. I hope we can find our way back to each other. But I am not going to pretend that what happened didn't happen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're the clearest person I know, Mom. It wasn't enough, and it was a start. Both things can be true. I think a lot about what my mother told me, about stillness in a room full of noise. I think about how long I have practiced that lesson and how many places it has served me. At work, when difficult colleagues tried to edge me out. In my marriage, in the hard years when Thomas and I were learning each other's worst edges. In the hospital waiting room, where I sat for 72 hours while they tried to save him, where being still was the only thing I could do. Stillness is not passivity. I want to be clear about that too. What I did at that dinner table was not passive. I had spent months preparing that moment. I had gathered evidence, consulted counsel, organized my thoughts. I had planned exactly how to speak and what to say and when to say it. Stillness is what you practice so that when the moment comes, you don't shatter, so that you can stand in the fire and not flinch. I want to say something to any woman who is reading or hearing this story and recognizing herself in it, because I think there are many of you. I have talked to friends, to women at my church, to women in line at the grocery store who, when the conversation turns just right, say something that sounds like what I lived. The woman whose daughter-in-law schedules her appointments without asking. The woman whose son has started CCing himself on her emails. The woman who mentioned offhand that she was thinking of selling her house and had 3 calls from her kids before nightfall. You are not confused. You are not fragile. You are not a liability. You are a woman who has survived things these people cannot imagine. You raised families and buried husbands and paid mortgages and kept the lights on and showed up and showed up and showed up. Your mind may move differently than it did at 30, but so does mine. And that is not the same as being gone. You are allowed to have opinions. You are allowed to make decisions. You are allowed to buy the car you want and keep the house you love and talk to your doctor yourself and manage your own affairs for as long as you are able, and you are the one who will know when that changes. Not your son, not your daughter-in-law, not the estate planner they invited to dinner. You are allowed to say, I see what is happening, and I will not pretend otherwise. I have thought often about what would have happened if I had not saved that voicemail. If the phone had rung and I had answered normally, and Marcus had heard my voice and recovered quickly, said he had meant to call someone else, laughed it off. The conversation at the dinner table would still have happened, but I would have walked in with a feeling and nothing more. A feeling is easy to dismiss. A feeling is exactly the kind of thing someone calls confusion. The voicemail was not revenge. I want to be precise about this. I did not play it to humiliate him. I did not invite David the estate planner so I would have a larger audience. Marcus did that. I played it because I needed something solid in the room, something that could not be reframed or re-explained or patted gently on the hand and told it had misunderstood. The truth is harder to dismiss when it comes out of a speaker. It is June now, 3 months since the dinner. The garden is growing well this year, the tomatoes especially, which Thomas always said I had no talent for, and which have proven him endearingly wrong for 11 consecutive summers. Ruth Ann comes by sometimes, and we sit in the garden and talk about our books and the neighbors, and the way the light falls in the late afternoon, and how neither of us can believe we are as old as we are because it does not feel like any age we were warned about. Marcus and I have spoken several times. There is still distance between us, not the cold, silent kind, but the measured kind, the kind that comes from being careful with something that was nearly broken. He came for Easter with the family. He did not bring David. He helped me in the kitchen without being asked, something he has not done in years. He asked my opinion on a decision he was making at work and actually listened to the answer. Small things. But I have always believed in small things. Ella texted me a few weeks after the dinner. She said, "Grandma, I'm really glad you said what you said." I wrote back, "I'm really glad you were there. I meant it." She is 15 and she sat at that table and she watched and she rearranged information. What she does with that, how she carries it forward, is her own story. But I hope it serves her. Diane came to visit in May. We did not talk about Marcus for the whole first day, which was its own kind of gift. We just cooked and walked, ate and sat on the porch and watched the evening come. On the second day, over coffee, she said, "Mama, how did you know what to do?" And I told her the truth. I said I didn't, not exactly. I said I just kept being still. I said I kept paying attention. I said I kept believing that knowing what was real was worth more than pretending everything was fine. She said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." I told her she already was. There is a kind of loneliness in getting older that no one prepares you for. It is not the loneliness of being alone. I know that kind, and I have made a kind of peace with it. It is the loneliness of being misread, of having your certainty mistaken for stubbornness, your experience mistaken for being stuck in the past, your quiet dignity mistaken for confusion, of being surrounded by people who love you, but who have started, without meaning to see you as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. The hardest part of what Marcus did was not the voicemail. It was the realization that he had already stopped seeing me clearly, that somewhere along the way, without my permission and without noticing himself, he had replaced his mother with a version of her that needed managing. That version was easier. That version didn't have a voice. That version didn't have a phone in her cardigan pocket. I am not that version. I have never been that version. And if there is one thing I could leave you with, One true thing from a 64-year-old woman with a good garden and a small brick house, and a daughter who calls every Sunday, and a son she is learning to love from a better distance. It is this: do not let anyone else write the story of who you are. Not when it is happening slowly, in gentle voices, over dinner with good dishes and a pound cake from scratch. Not even when it comes from someone you love. The notebook is in the drawer by the stove. The voicemail is saved in 3 places. The attorney's number is in my phone. My house is mine. My mind is mine. My story is mine. I am not confused. I never was. If this story found you in a place you recognize, if you know what it feels like to have someone speak about you as though you aren't in the room, to have your clarity questioned, to sit at a table where the conversation is supposedly about your well-being, but is actually about someone else's comfort, I want you to hear this. You are not alone, and you are not done. There is still so much that is yours. Margaret Louise Hale, Cartersville, Georgia.